Good afternoon and welcome back, everybody. My name's Cody. I'm the head of safety at RAOZ, and again, pleased to introduce our next session for today for National Safety Month 2021. Firstly, I'd like to start off by thanking our National Safety Month sponsors. Without our sponsors, we would not be able to have more than $10,000 worth of giveaways that we've got available throughout the month of October. And of course, by tuning in today, you do get an additional entry into those prize draws. So we appreciate you tuning in. I'd like to thank Garmin, who's a gold sponsor of National Safety Month and the sponsor of today's presentations. You can check out their range of products online at www.garmin.com, and you can also tune into their presentation tomorrow afternoon where their representative will be going through their range of products that are available. Just before we get started, on the right-hand side of your screen, there should be a chat bar. In there, please enter your questions for the team today, and they'll be more than happy to answer those questions as we go along. If that chat bar is not open, then there should be a blue chat box down the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. If you hit that, it should open that Q&A panel from there. So, on that note, I will welcome in today's presenters, our ops team at RAOZ. We've got Jill Bailey and we've got Jordan Portlock. G'day, team.
Howdy. Thanks, Cody.
No worries. I will hand over and disappear into the background. Have fun.
Yeah, disappear into the background and play with slides and buttons and things. All right, so operations at non-controlled airports, which is probably the majority of our members' operations. I'm going to put up a bit of a slideshow this time. And what we're trying what we are going to be talking about today is making sure we stay safe, managing situational awareness so this doesn't happen. This is a near-miss proximity event in New Zealand at an airport that I can't pronounce, but Cody can probably pronounce for us. And as you can see, there's two aircraft there, low wing and high wing, in fairly close proximity. Now, I reckon if I ask the question, what issues you have experienced in the audience operating at non-controlled aerodromes, we'll probably fill the Q&A box up, and that's actually what I want to do. So put forward your scenarios, keep them nice and succinct if you can, and we'll talk about a few of them if we, as we get time throughout the presentation. So today, our intent is to talk about our aim, which is to operate and interact safely with other airspace users at non-controlled airports. And an outcome will be to find and use resources, develop strategies, habits and actions to help us stay safe. So, Jordan, why is an airport the most dangerous place to fly and the most common location for mid-air or proximity events?
Good question, Jill, and g'day everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I guess just because of everybody's trying to do the same thing, and because it's just a hub for activity. There's a lot of different aeroplanes there. If you're out in the middle of nowhere, the chances are there's not going to be anybody else around. However, everybody needs to start from an airport of some description and will fly to an airport of some description generally. So there are a lot of people that congregate around those areas. And then you add into the mix the different types of aeroplanes that go in to CTAFs, anywhere from the old rag and tube aircraft doing 40 knots up to 737s and Dash 8s and things like that at some of the regional hubs. It makes it quite an interesting place and a place where we can have close proximity events quite easily.
Perfect. Anyone think we'd prepared that earlier? It's exactly right. The airport is the place where we're going to go, the place where we're going to take off, the place where all aircraft will congregate, and the airspace around that, within about 5 nautical miles, will be where those circuits will mix. And we're going to talk a little bit about the sorts of things you could be thinking about on the way to the airport, while you're flying, coming into an airport. We're going to be talking about some of the distractions that we have. We're going to talk about some of the tools that we have to assist us, etc. So let's get stuck into that. 6 Ps, the polite version is 5. Prior planning prevents poor performance. The safe flight starts as you drive to the airport, and we talked about this earlier in our currency presentation, on the way to the airport, you can be observing the weather, you can be observing the traffic levels as you get near the airport, you can be thinking about your flight, you can be considering what will happen with turbulence or effects of winds, you can be thinking about all sorts of factors that might relate to your conduct of safe flight at the airport. Once you get there, obviously, well, even before you get there, there's one more important thing that I wanted to touch on. No TAMs. Even when we're when flying locally, one of the habits that I get into, and I hope all pilots get into, particularly if they're flying from a reasonably busy airport or any airport with other traffic, is no TAMs. And as a perfect example, here at Temora, our runway 1836 is actually currently got a big hole across the middle of it. They're putting drainage works in. So they notamed that runway was shut. And I have heard a story about a fairly large, fast corporate jet coming in and landing on the closed runway and putting a fairly severe flat spot on their tyres, stopping in time to not fall into the ditch that's along the runway. So that pilot did not provide proper planning and didn't read the NOTAM, which clearly said 1836 was not available. So let's not fall into those sorts of habits. Let's get ourselves into a professional state of mind and do the proper planning prior, which would include NOTAMs, weather, aircraft, etc. While we're talking about radio as the next point there, which is obviously important, as we're taxiing out or before we start, we have an obligation under our cars, which will obviously be heading over to Part 91 very shortly, to confirm the radio is working. So how can you do that? If there's other airspace users, you can ask for a radio check. You can use the AWIS to confirm that you've triggered the AWIS by transmitting and that you can receive the AWIS, and you're obviously monitoring the calls. That's a pretty critical part. Would you agree, Jordan, about making sure your situational awareness starts?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely important to make sure your radio is working. And there's a number of things that you can put in place to make sure that's happening. If you don't hear anybody, and it's usually quite a busy CTAF, that's one way to trigger, well, what's going on? What's happening with my radio? Obviously not everywhere is that busy, but that's one way to do it. The other way is just back to the 5 or 6 Ps, is get a handheld radio, put it in your car on the way to the airport, listen to what's going on. And that'll give you an idea of the traffic level before you even get in the aircraft. When you're operating from a towered environment, obviously it's quite easy because you generally make a call, or it's often busier in terms of radio calls. Not always though, at some of our busy CTAFs, but you have to talk to somebody. So the radio check is not as required, because if you don't get a response from the tower or from another pilot, you'll know about it pretty quick.
Good call. So some of the things that will happen will be you might not have the correct frequency dialed up. You might have bumped it. You might have flip-flopped to the other frequency, which might be the AWIS, or it might not be the CTAF. Someone might have bumped the tuning dials. The volume could be down. Your headsets might not be plugged in properly. Your battery in your headset might be flat. I broke the lead on my headset the other day just by moving my seat forward. That pretty much stopped the flight before we even started. And the other thing is, as you said, Jordan, it's a really interesting point about radio and hearing something or expecting to hear something. Alerted, see and avoid, and the current guidance from CASA says make calls as situationally required. Now, if you taxi out and you don't hear anything, you could be tempted to say, okay, there's no one else in the area, I won't make a call. That's not a great idea. You're about to go from a non-active area in the taxiway, cross the holding point and onto a runway potentially, or expectingly. So you should make a call before you do that. It's not a requirement, it's a recommendation. I would like to see us return back to the good old days of these calls are required. Makes life nice and simple, but I'm a simple person. But, think about what the other pilot's going to do. If they're operating in the circuit, they don't make any noise because they haven't heard anyone. You taxi out, you don't make any noise because you haven't heard anyone. We've got the perfect recipe for a potential collision or issue.
Of course, we can take that further and say, do all aircraft have to have radios, Jill?
That's a very good question, Jordan. Depending on the airport, no, they don't. If they're a uncertified airport or they don't have a requirement in their URSA entry, then there's no requirement necessarily to have a radio. There's also no requirement for us to carry radios outside of certified registered CTAFs for the military. Airports up to 5,000 feet. So radio is only one tool in the toolbox. There's plenty of other tools there that we can be using. The devices, ADS-B, EC devices, OzRunways AvPlan, the good old iPad and tablet on your lap, seeing what's going on. There's another device that can add to our toolbox, but can also add to our distraction. So we should be looking out and basically building the picture. And those toolboxes are a useful device. They certainly shouldn't be replacing eyes outside in the cockpit. So we've got some stories happening. We'll come back, Nicholas, to your story in a second. I appreciate you putting that forward. Build the picture. So now we've gone to the airport, we've prior planned, we've got our radio working, we've made sure we've called before we entered the active runway. We haven't relied on our devices in the cockpit. We've used them as an adjunct to our alerted see and avoid. As we're taxiing, we're thinking about the wind. We're holding our controls into wind as we move around the airport. We think about what traffic is there. I think one of the key things that's important is to fly as expected, and it kind of speaks to Nicholas's point, but we'll talk about that in a bit more detail, Nicholas, in a minute. Consistent circuit, calls and procedures and positions. I've got a slide in a minute that will refer to the appropriate positions in a circuit, but I know we've probably all had the scenario where someone has called up and said, I'm on base for runway X. You look out into the appropriate position, they're not there. You look in the reciprocal position and that's where they are. Now that's the sort of stuff that can happen to anybody. We all get runway directions mixed up. We all get base, left base, right base, all of those sorts of things confused. So I guess the key message there is to never assume. Certainly the call is to say I'm on base. You should expect to see them at a particular position, height relative to the runway. However, if you don't, either they're a little bit further away than they called, which is a little annoying, or they're not where they think they are and they're actually in the other end. So that's a fairly important point. You got anything to put forward on that one, Jordan?
I just keep thinking, you talked about the radio, you talked about the devices which can enhance our situational awareness, you talked about building the picture, but it all just comes back to see and avoid. We've got the radio to help aid our situational awareness, but it's all about looking out the window, looking out the front and working out where these people are. And as you said, if we can help other pilots by being predictable, it makes life a hell of a lot easier. But it's all about using the radio to augment our visual scan. And I know you're going to talk about that later, but just looking out the front.
Yep, perfect. So scan process, yes, I've got a couple of graphics in a second. Flying to other airports is exactly the same process from the other direction, as in we're coming into the airport. We call up the frequency well in advance to hear what we may expect to hear. We might be able to call up an AWIS so we understand what direction the circuit might be doing, the traffic might be doing. We might hear glider ops, we might hear parachute ops, we might hear anything that might give us a bit of a clue. And one of the techniques I like to do is to actually visualize where my circuit's going to be. And I'm a good old-fashioned kind of person. I've got a piece of paper often with the runway directions always oriented to the north so that I can actually say, I'm coming from the west. The runway should be across my flight path. I should expect to join on the other side, which is the dead side. So you actually construct your approach a long way out, because once you get in there, you should be doing checks. You're looking for traffic. You're a pretty busy kind of person. So if you can prepare well before you get anywhere near that airport and think about what your approach path should look like, it'll take a lot of the workload off. So we might just go on to the next slide, which is talking about the scanning technique. So all I've done is just grabbed a heap of screenshots from all those wonderful people online who put these photos up. It's very helpful. There's a range of scan techniques here. We're not advocating any one particular technique. What we are saying is that the scan must be a logical construction of the movement of the eye. The movement of the eye must be in stages, because as we all know, if we go from left to right or right to left very quickly, we won't actually see what's in front of us. So talking about 10 to 15 degrees worth of movement, moving up and down as we go across. We might include or incorporate an instrument scan as part of that to go back. We can go up, down. We can do any number of these, whatever works for you and your environment. But the point is to keep your eyes out on stalks and have a consistent pattern. And on the top right there, you can see there's an aircraft in the top right, and we would expect from the graphic that we've got there that aircraft should not conflict with us because it appears to be going the other way. What's the key thing that we would notice if that aircraft was going to conflict with us, Jordan?
In the same position in the window, just getting bigger.
Yeah, exactly. In other words, it's not going to be moving relative to its position in our windscreen. It is just simply maybe getting bigger very quickly. It might sit there for a long time not doing anything, and we might think it's a bug on the windscreen, but suddenly it will become quite big as our closing speeds increase. And bug on the windscreen, perfect example of making sure your windscreen's clean as part of your preparation as well. So I've got a couple of really good comments going on here. Let's have a quick look at some of those. So Nicholas, 25 years ago, I was doing circuits at Charleville, about 300 feet on final. A tiger moth flew underneath me and landed. When I later confronted the pilot, he was unapologetic and accused me of doing 747 circuits. A couple of threads to unpick on that one, Nicholas. I bet it was a little bit of a shock to you to have a tiger moth fly underneath you. 300 feet on final, that's exactly where it's likely to happen. Confronting the pilot, I'm sure that's not what you did. You probably went up and chatted to the pilot professionally, as I know you do. He was unapologetic. Well, that's pilot's problem. The 747 circuit, that's one of the most common gripes, I guess, we hear between CASA operating pilots and RAL's pilots, or between powered parachute, weight shift microlight, or genuinely between 747s and lighter aircraft sharing the same circuit. And we'll get to a graphic in a minute that talks about the differences in physical location for a circuit. I guess the key message here is to say, if I hear a call from a tiger moth, and we'll assume, Nicholas, you didn't in this case, but if you were to hear a call from a tiger moth, you might expect that person to be flying fairly close, because a tiger moth is a pretty draggy aircraft. So if a pilot's flying in a very proactive way, they're going to be flying should be flying within their glide distance if an engine problem occurs, which means they're going to be quite close. If you're flying an aircraft that's got a much better glide ratio, you might be flying further out. And that's where we get that conflict about 747 circuits and close-in circuits and all of those sorts of things. No one pilot is correct in that circumstance. The pilot is doing the correct thing for their operation. But what we need to do is collaborate in the community of safety. I'm going to steal that phrase from Tiffany. Thanks, from Air Services. Thanks, Tiff. The community of safety is what we operate in at an airport or in any environment as pilots, air traffic controllers, maintainers, aircraft operators, whatever it happens to be. We are all working to be community of safety. So therefore, we should all be helping each other to remain safe. We've got one there from Cody. Now, do I need to get a New Zealand accent, Cody, to read this one? Had a close call with a glider when flying a tow plane in New Zealand. Gliders can be extremely hard to see, and if gliding competitions are taking place, you may have 30 plus gliders operating within close proximity. Please report close calls to RAL so we can monitor for hotspots where we might be able to improve safety. Yeah, a glider, extremely thin profile, obviously very long, thin wings, high aspect ratio, and if there's 30 of them operating, there could be gliders in any area, or there could be 30 of them in a gaggle. Jordan, have you got any close encounter stories along those lines?
Probably the same with the glider story as Cody. Just to remind people that they don't always have radios. They might operate without radios, or they might operate on a UHF frequencies, depending on where they are. And it just comes back to being predictable. They're not as predictable to 3-axis powered pilots as they are to themselves, and sometimes they're quite difficult to see. And Cody's put up another question about who has right of way. If we talk about right of way with gliders, we obviously need to remind ourselves that aircraft that don't have power or don't have the ability to go around are the ones that have right of way. So we need to take that into consideration when we're going into a CTAF airport that has gliding traffic. And what is one of the ways that we can work that out? Well, we've got social media and all that stuff these days that we can work out when they're going to be operating and speaking to people, but also on your maps. You've got the gliding symbols on your VNC or VTC or your WAC. I'm not sure on the WAC, but the VNC or VTC definitely, so that you can work out that they're there. And then when you fly over the top, look next to the primary windsock, you'll see that double cross essentially. That'll help you out. So just some tips to watch out for gliders.
Yeah, and look, one of the good things, again, I keep using Temora as an example because I live here. We've got an aerodrome safety committee. And we formed that because we've got the Temora Aviation Museum, who operate a massive variety of warbirds, everything from a tiger moth and a Ryan, which are at the slower end of the scale, right up to a sabre, a vampire and a Canberra. And they can operate at any time, as is their right and privilege. We have the gliding operations, and they can be operating either private ops, or they often host some pretty big competitions. We have RAL's flight training, we have CASA flight training, we have a heap of residents who operate a variety of aircraft, from powered parachutes all the way up to whatever your heart desires. The main thing that's important there is that we do communicate very regularly. If the gliding club is having a camp or a comp, they will advise the safety panel. They'll put information in residents' letterboxes, and they'll obviously put NOTAMs out. So there's almost no excuse at Temora for not knowing that there's a glider comp on or a camp on, because they will do the proactive things. But, you know, it doesn't happen at all airports. If it doesn't happen at your airport, you can be the initiating person that actually approaches these people and says, let's start some sort of a safety committee. So you might only have to have one meeting a year. You might have one every 3 months to start with when you first start. And the most important part is to actually understand each other's operations, which is probably one of the keys for why interactions in the circuit do happen. And close encounters happen, is because we don't understand what's going on in the other pilot's world. And there's a pretty stellar example that stands out in my mind. After a fly-in in South Australia, in your neck of the woods, Jordan, there were a number of warbirds trying to depart. There were a number of RAOS aircraft trying to depart. The warbirds had taxied to get to the end of the runway and were sitting outside the gable markers warming up. And they made a call that one of the aircraft made a call they were going to be departing on the runway at the same time as one of our aircraft entered the runway to take off. Fortunately, they only exchanged paint on the wingtips. But what actually occurred was that the warbird, being a tail dragger, had absolutely no visibility forward at all. And the RAL's aircraft was a high wing as well. And had no visibility as they turned onto the runway to see that aircraft was starting to move, or to see the cloud of dust behind them as they threw the power on. So again, clearing the airspace, clearing the runway before you enter. So a little bit of a waggle from the warbird to perhaps clear their runway ahead of them, and a clearing waggle on the taxiway by the Jabiru aircraft would have made that less likely to occur. As I said, luckily we only had a report of exchange of paint. So most pilots should be pretty aware and familiar with this. That's from CAP 166. We've got a heap of handouts as PDFs in the handout section there. This is from CAP 166, and it describes the types of positions for joining. We know about the extended downwind, the 45-degree downwind, the joining on base, the straight-in approach, and the joining midfield crosswind. And we also should be very familiar with the heights above the aerodrome elevation for overfly. But one of the things that probably does catch people out potentially at some of these airports is the fact that the faster aircraft above 150 knots will actually do circuits at 1,500 AGL. So if we, as our RAL's pilot world, putter along at 1,500 AGL to join, we're actually going to be in conflict with those aircraft potentially. So again, it's a question of knowing that at Mildura or Dubbo or Wagga, there will be aircraft that will be flying at 150 knots or faster. We should overfly at 2,000 AGL in that instance. Don't be lazy and assume there's no one else operating at those heights. Got anything to add there, Jordan, before I go on?
Probably just with the CAT 156 stuff, we talked about it before, just to remind everybody that there's going to be a change. We constantly refer to CAR 166 and CAP 166, and there's going to be a change December 2nd. So in, what's that, 34 days or whatever it's going to be. it's going to move to Part 91. So all the information in there will go to Part 91, and Part 91 Manual of Standards as well. So we're providing some communications on that, but we suggest that you go and have a look. Generally, there's not a huge amount of regulatory changes. There are a few gotchas in there, but in terms of this, the information is still the same, but it's just going to be in a different location. So just to remind everybody that it will change, and you do need to keep up with the regulatory changes that happen December this year.
Perfect. Thanks, Jordan. So we've got CAP 166 in the handouts. We're going to be promulgating the Part 91 equivalent, but the plain English guide is probably your best port of call. I'm sure Cody's probably going to be putting that up in the handouts shortly as well. Neil, I fly from an airfield that has all circuits to the west. Have seen a number of occasions people doing an easterly circuit as they have not checked the ERSA and not called ahead of their departure flying into that airport. Totally understand this one. Used to fly from an airport where all the circuits were to the east. So we had right-hand circuits on 3-4 and 1-3 and left-hand circuits on 3-1. Whatever the circumstances were, all the circuits were out one way, and we would routinely be turning base and go head-to-head with someone who was coming in on what would be a standard left-hand circuit. So again, expect the unexpected in some circumstances, but yeah, prior planning preventing the poor performance in that instance, particularly, I think. The next slide is actually a couple of YouTube videos, and we want to basically not play that one. We want to play this one and talk about the implications. Let's have a look at this. If I push play, it'll work better. So we can see here two aircraft converging. If we watch on the right on the inset, we will see that was extraordinarily close. Actually kind of sends shivers up my spine every time I watch this one. And the Cessna pilot conducts a go-around, having had the doobies scared out of him, as does the Cub. We'll just watch that again purely because I think it's worthwhile. So again, we can actually see what's occurring here. There's two converging aircraft on a single runway. But if we just pause there, we can see that the Cub pilot may well be intending to land on the tarmac section there, but is not particularly aligned if we're talking about a pilot sitting in the centre of the aircraft. And the Cessna is coming in from the right-hand side, having done a right turn. So we're not sure about the rules at this particular airport, but the result is certainly the closest proximity event I've seen in a long time. And there's some very excited Italians on that recording as well, watching from the ground, probably also quite excited about that. There's a still of how close that was. I don't think you would want to have that being any closer than that. And the other video we've got is a similar shot of the same event, a bit longer version. So we can see that the Cub is not particularly aligned, I would say, on the tarmac section. And I would say that the Cessna was also probably not particularly aligned coming from the right on the tarmac section. And of course, they've both intersected the same area of space, because in Australia, at least, we're all expected to be established on final wings level 500 AGL 500 metres out from the runway, which is probably about where these aircraft are from the looks of it. That's kind of horrifying. Both pilots react quite well. One stays low, decides he's not going to make it, and does a go around, which probably also caused its own issues because now he's not sure where the other aircraft is. And the piloot elected to go around completely. Should have moved to the right-hand side of the runway to keep visibility of the aircraft that went low. So again, just watching that, just because it's worth watching one more time. If you do a search, you'll find this on YouTube. You can do your own analysis on this. But watching from a fair way out, we can see the Cub is not particularly established on the centre line. It's a pretty common error that low time students make, and it's a fairly regular error that pilots make too, not being established on the centre line. You can see the runway's well to the right there. So the pilot should have established a little bit further into the runway centre line before turning. And I would say potentially, because the Cub is a high wing, would have been nice to have tipped that wing up, had a good look underneath before actually continuing to turn. So really useful video, I think, and I'm sure we'll be getting some comments about that. In the meantime, Peter, thanks for joining us. Recall transiting near parks a number of years ago. There was a gliding competition tuned to the frequency they were to be using, but no one responded. I diverted further away and super scanned to avoid conflicts. I don't know if this is widely known, but there are 3 distinct and discrete glider frequencies. Now I'm going to try and remember what they are. No, I'm not going to even guess. There are 3 specific frequencies that gliders will use and reference when they're in a gaggle, which are unique to the gliding fraternity. And they are also requested where possible, if their aircraft allow it, to also monitor the CTAF or the area as well. But yes, Peter, Parkes, Narromine, Tocumwal, Narrogin, there are any number of locations in Australia where there are a lot of established gliding operations, and we're certainly not having a go at our gliding fraternity. They do a very good job maintaining situational awareness, etc. as well. Yeah, just need to be super alert when it comes to those sorts of locations. Just go back to my slide. So what we've got here is I've just taken a few screenshots of some CASA resources, and there are a ton of really good resources. The most amazing part about this is the resources are available for free, which always makes all pilots' ears prick up. All you need to do is pay a $15 packaging fee or postage fee, and you can order any number of these resources, including the Avoiding Collisions in Class G airspace over on the left there, is a handout. Be seen, be heard, be seen, be safe. I'm sure our CEO, Matt, will be happy that I've mentioned that one. I know he was very involved in that when he was with CASA. I've got a general guide to help you keep safe, CAP 166, a poster about being on the right frequency. You could put that poster up at your hangar or your aero club. And of course, you can purchase or download the VFRG, which has got a whole heap of plain English, easily accessible and easily researched and discovered references for pilots to operate in and around in visual flight rules. Jordan, have you got anything to add there before I continue blathering?
No, I'm just waiting for a comment. So a good one from Lloyd, one of our CFIs. G'day again, Lloyd. Had a Cessna fly across in front of us while on downwind at circuit height, continued across the airport into the distance. No radio reports from the Cessna. Now, I'd say that's a reasonably common one that happens around the country. And people mistake the frequency or, think they're transmitting or they're on the wrong. If we've got dual comms or 3 comms, they might be transmitting on the wrong on frequency or something like that. I know I keep banging on about it, but otherwise Neil will hurt me, I reckon. But it's all about it's see and avoid, and we have the alert from the radio, but it's all about looking out. So in that instance, it's quite unfortunate that happened, Lloyd, but obviously you saw the traffic and you were able to move around them, so there wasn't any conflict, or there was less of a conflict than there could have been. And then, as you mentioned before, Jill, it's just about going up to the pilot and just having a bit of a chat to them and just say, hey, did you see me? What frequency are you on? Just having a bit of a discussion. Now, pilots have egos and they don't like to talk about that stuff. But as you said before, we're all equally responsible for safety. And going up and just sort of talking to them about that sort of stuff is really important.
So Cody keeps putting that question to the top because he obviously wants us to answer it. Who has right of way in the circuit if the aircraft ahead of me downwind is conducting wide circuits? The aircraft in front of you has right of way. You do not cut in front of anyone, regardless of whether they're flying a 747 circuit or otherwise. You are expected to remain in sequence for that aircraft. If you can't do that and you're not comfortable, depart. Leave the circuit if you're not happy following that aircraft flying massive circuits. The opposite can happen, particularly when we've got CFIs doing training who can often try to compress some circuit training in and do 500 AGL circuits with with students to compress that experience and put them under a bit of load to see whether they can handle that. Likewise, you're going to have to follow that aircraft and make sure you don't cut in, which is the whole intent of this graphic. So if you've got someone flying a nice big wide -8 circuit, theoretically you're a 500 feet below them flying in a medium performance aircraft, and a low performance aircraft or a powered parachute or a weight shift microlight will be lower again by 500 feet and inside. So if you saw that from the side, you'd be staggered quite nicely in terms of distance from each other, and therefore the distance that you're traveling and the width of your circuit will be proportionately wider. But if they're ahead of you and they're way out and you virtually think they're in the next county or country doing their circuit, you are still expected to follow them. I don't advocate calling up and saying, hey, can I cut in front of you? Because you might not necessarily be seeing the other aircraft, which is also following that aircraft. So I would just stick with following that aircraft as you are expected and required to do. Jennifer, would it be safer when planning to plan via overhead and airport or a beam if that's a direct track for you? There you go, Jordan. There's a good one for you. What's your thoughts?
I think if you're planning to fly over at, for instance, anywhere below 3,000, 3,500, depending on what is going on at your airport, then it's probably beneficial to fly a beam. If you're flying over the top at anything above that, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9,000, then it's probably not an issue flying directly overhead. And that then comes to radio congestion. Quite often we'll hear pilots make transiting calls at 8,000 feet. And we just asked to really think about whether there's any implications to the traffic in the circuit at that height, and then make a call as responsible. The CASA in Part 91, the change is going to be to make a call only when the pilot in command considers it reasonably necessary to broadcast to avoid the risk of a collision. Well, obviously, in my scenario at 8,000 feet, probably not a huge chance of a collision at the CTAF.
Unless there's parachute operations.
Unless there's parachute operations, unless there's jets taking off from it, and it depends on the CTAF itself. But when you've got a CTAF when there's none of that, I guess it's about working to your location.
Yep. Yeah. I don't think there's any one regulation that answers your question, Jennifer, but it is specific, I guess, to, as Jordan says, the type of operations. Certainly at Temora, we did have, again, parachute operations. They were climbing out overhead and would be letting out upwind, so the parachutists can drift down with wind to the landing area. So if you're flying overhead, you're going to have to get to 16 or 20,000 to get over the top of them. So flying a beam or a round would be sensible in those circumstances. So it is going to be location specific, I think. Stan, I was following a charter Cessna into Rawnsley Park near Wilpena Pound, one of the most gorgeous areas to fly in. The pilot undertook a very wide circuit. Well, yes, the pilot may undertake a very wide circuit. And as we've said, the answer is don't be tempted to cut in. Don't be tempted to shortcut the process. If they're flying such a wide circuit that you're not comfortable, you believe you're outside your gliding distance or unsafe, bug out and come back in potentially to the circuit would be my answer, but you should be following that aircraft. Neil, have you tried to get our friends at Oz Runways and Avplan to share the user data so our EFBs will have more aircraft location information? Well, certainly that would be helpful, and it's certainly one of the tools in our arsenal, as we say back here, tools in our toolbox. However, I would not be relying on Oz Runways or Avplan in the circuit at all. Certainly flying around A to B or in a cross-country situation, it's helpful, but I would much rather just keep my eyes out. Another good change that's, or a good point to notice the change that's coming up with Part 91 is the change in hemispherical lowest heights. It used to be, or currently until the 2nd of December, from 5,000 AMSL and above, you would be flying on the hemispherical level plus 500 feet for VFR aircraft. Once Part 91 is enacted on 2nd of December, it will be when you're 3,000 AMSL and above, or if you're 1,500 AGL and above. It's recommended where situationally and operationally possible to fly the hemispherical, so the heights plus 500 for VFR aircraft. And I got a perfect example of that just recently flying in Temora. Again, flying locally, so having a nice little jolly around. It was just after the New South Wales lockdown, so I was kind of keen to get out and get into my aircraft again. We were just flying locally in the area, and we were transiting to the east and saw an aircraft transiting south to north at our height, and obviously neither of us saw each other until it was kind of, whoa, where'd that come from moments. So again, the scanning technique is what saved us there. Because it was a local flight, I didn't have an iPad. I don't actually use that for in-flight information in the same way that many people do. So the thing that saved me there was my scanning technique, and the fact that I was, even though I was flying along fat, dumb and happy, as they say, just having a nice little local flight, I still continued the scanning technique to make sure I wasn't going to conflict with anyone. Jennifer, got some great questions, Jennifer. Thank you. How do FLARMs work? I'm not going to give you the technical explanation because I don't know. But my understanding, and someone from our audience might be able to pop in, or Jordan, you might have some more info, but the FLARM effectively communicates to other FLARMs. I don't know specifically whether it will communicate with EC devices or ADS-B, but it is a unique device that's being used for glider operations, and certainly helps the gliding fraternity to stay safe in gaggles, which is why the device was invented. If you've got 30 aircraft all trying to fly in the one thermal circling very, very close to each other, the FLARMs give you avoidance information relative to your direction and distance for where the aircraft that's in conflict will appear. Jordan, I don't know if you've got any more to add to that one.
I don't know a huge amount about FLARM. I think you can link them with ADS-B, or they sort of have an output like that. But I'm sure Cody's probably got some more information, and he can reach out to Jennifer, as he's doing now, to give us some more information on that.
Yep, perfect. And Cody's put another question up. How can I best manage distractions such as EFBs to ensure I don't end up with my eyes inside the cockpit? I'll throw to you on that one, Jordan, so I can have a drink.
I think the easiest way to do that, seeing as we're both instructors, put our instructor hat on, is go back to the thing you learned when you were doing forced landings or engine failure after takeoff or something. Aviate, navigate, communicate. Make sure you fly the airplane first, which includes your situational awareness, your aeronautical decision making, your lookouts and all that sort of stuff. And then use your iPad as part of the navigate and communicate as required, depending on what you're using it for, whether navigation, tracking, or looking for traffic. It's just really important to just make sure to look outside, and they're very easy to give us a lot of information. You know, nice shiny screen with moving things on it. Humans like nice shiny things, so we tend to look at it and rely on it. And back to Neil's point before about trying to speak to OzRunways and AvPlan, there are other apps and things you can run simultaneously which will give you more information, but it's really important to remember that not all of the aircraft flying will have ADS-B, not all of the aircraft will have a transponder. So a lot of the aircraft that actually fly around, especially in the RAOS fleet, will not be able to be shown up on there at all. So it's a great aid. It's great to use it to aid situational awareness, but that's about it. And the best thing to do is just look out the window again.
That's it. Yep. Have a look out the window, see what's going on, develop your situational awareness, etc. Neil's actually come back with an answer saying, I think FLARMs only work in close proximity. I think you're right, Neil. There's a very much a limitation on range. They won't work over a great distance because their intention is to manage the gaggles of the gliding fraternity. So we've covered some really good topics. I'll go back to this. I didn't actually get to finish explaining. If you go to the CASA online store, you have to create an account, but that's not really that big a deal. There are a ton of resources in terms of DVDs, there's posters, there's Z cards, there's handouts that are given or available, and a whole lot of other information on a range of topics. And if you're a club president or a CFI, or even just a pilot that likes that sort of stuff, you can just, as I said, for a flat $15, I think it is, fee, you can order a ton of promotional material. There's also a whole heap of really cool planning information. There's a pack which is for flight planning, which includes planning charts and pads. It includes all sorts of information and DVDs on how to plan flights. There are just incredible resources on the CASA site, and as I said, one flat fee, no matter what you order, although they'd obviously prefer you not to order one thing. And if you're going to pay $15, you might as well order a few things. So we can actually find the website. I think it's just CASA Online Store. And I would certainly encourage all of our CFIs, all of our instructors, and even pilots and aero clubs to grab those posters and put them up. I know I've got a poster up behind me there that's for carburetor icing range, as an example, the sort of temperatures and humidity factors that will cause carburetor icing. There's a poster up there about carriage of radio and ADS-B for various airspaces, etc. So there's a whole range of resources. So I guess what we're trying to avoid are these sorts of issues. There's just a snapshot of some excitement that has occurred to some of our pilots. The one on the top left is not an RAL's aircraft. It certainly looks like he's in a bit of a world of hurt, he or she, possibly in the beginning stages of a spin. The poor little foxbat there is a bit of a testament to the strength of those aircraft after a landing incident, and the aircraft on the ground there is certainly not aligned with the centre line of the runway, so they've had a bit of an interesting, exciting time of it there too. So we don't have any more questions. Have you got any other points or thoughts there, Jordan, to add to what we've been talking about?
I'll take Lloyd's comment. Lloyd's just come up with another gripe of his. Pilots approaching an unfamiliar airport in the wrong frequency, and then using non-compliant circuit directions, not bothering to look up special procedures, appropriate frequencies. That just comes back to the planning that you talked about before. Jill, the 5 or 6 Ps is we want to be predictable, and we want to have plans in our own mind. And if you look at the video that we watched before of the 2 aircraft in close proximity, you know, we can help to mitigate that by that planning and knowing what the circuit direction is and the frequencies. And I touched on that a little bit before about people using the wrong frequency or thinking they're on the correct frequency, but they're not. And it just really comes back to that planning.
Yeah, and actually, back to the teaching days, I actually was fortunate enough, we've got a painted floor on the hangar where I was teaching, and my husband was kind enough to paint me the directions of Temora Airport's runways in proportion, correct orientation, including taxiways and all sorts of other stuff. When the plane was out of the hangar, we could actually walk that as students. So we could actually run scenarios and have the student or pilot give the correct response. So we would simulate an aircraft coming in from the west with an aircraft established on a circuit, and then try and work out where those aircraft may intersect, what sort of calls the pilots can make. So effectively we're doing scenario-based simulations on the ground. Because I think probably one of the challenges for all of us is we are two-dimensional beings most of the time. We don't move necessarily in the 3 dimensions. So the hardest challenge for us is to work out heights relative to other aircraft, and then our bearing and locations to ground-based features. So I would commend that as an idea for you. I used to draw it in chalk on the concrete floor before we painted it, and it was a really useful resource because it allowed you to press pause and say stop where you are. Now, where are you in relation to the airport? Where is that aircraft in relation to you? What call should you make? And the point I was always making to my students was to say, what does that pilot need to know about what you're doing? Not what you think you need to tell them. What do they need to know to make sure that they remain safe? Neil, yes, another good point, and it speaks to that new proximity event that we had put up in our video. When you do a turn in a high wing aircraft, you lift the wing prior and take a quick look. Do the same thing on the ground with a high wing aircraft. Do the bit of a waggle on the ground to clear the airspace with the wing out of the way before you actually proceed onto the runway. All of that's talking about just good basic pilot disciplines for making sure you don't necessarily interact with someone unexpectedly. What about some war stories, Jordan? Sure, we've got some war stories.
Oh, yeah, but people want to hear them.
Yeah, of course I do.
Just the same things, people not making calls or close proximity. When I was doing charter a while ago, I came into Lee Creek and people were coming back from the fly-in from William Creek, and there was probably 8 or 9 RLS aircraft that came in just before me. And one of the guys, I came in behind him on Australian approach, and he elected to do a go-around because he felt we were a bit too close, and then came up and was a bit disgruntled when he spoke to me. And we just talked about that I had in visual, and what I learned is just that we can increase that communication from there. Now, I was comfortable where I was. He obviously couldn't see me coming behind him, and I was going probably 3 times his speed. So I can understand why he would be a bit worried about that, but it just comes down to that communication. I told him what I was doing. He didn't really talk to me. I probably could have talked more. Yeah, just increase that communication. And to the pilot's credit, he did the correct thing. He wasn't comfortable, so he elected to do a go around and then came in behind me after that. So it's just about talking and talking so that we can avoid the risk of a collision.
And interestingly, in that scenario, it was your responsibility to avoid the collision because you were behind the pilot ahead. So the fact that the pilot ahead decided to take that preemptive action and do a go around is perfectly acceptable. There is never a circumstance where a go around is not a good option, I think, in those sorts of circumstances. But yeah, the expectation or assumption potentially that the pilot behind was just going to run into you, like you were going to run into them, I don't think that's necessarily the case. If we're going to talk about gripes, Lloyd, I've got a personal gripe about people announcing their positions in the circuit 10 minutes before they're there. If you're going to join crosswind, wait until you are on crosswind. If you're going to join base, wait until you are at base. Don't announce 10 miles out that you're coming in and you're going to be joining base. That's not helpful to me. I need to know when you are joining base, as an example. Linda, and thank you again, Linda, for the help you and Ken gave us yesterday with the panel. That was a really good discussion. I encourage everyone to go back and have a look at that YouTube video if you missed it. A hotspot at Bendigo on a busy day is the intersection between aeroplanes climbing on crosswind about to turn downwind and aircraft joining on downwind from outside. Situational awareness when there are a lot of calls can be a challenge. And that's a situation where radio calls need to be kept concise and accurate for phraseology, and basically potentially reduced where possible to avoid a congested frequency. So I'm not saying or advocating not to make radio calls, but I'm also trying to encourage pilots to think about the call, make it as concise and accurate as they can, so that the other pilot will understand where you are. That's a particularly scary one, Linda, potentially, if you're joining up you're climbing out on crosswind to turn downwind, depending on the aircraft. There's a lot of high wings being used down there at Bendigo. You might not have visibility of the aircraft about to join downwind. So very challenging. And my personal strategy operating at a busy airport like that is to join midfield crosswind, because I think it gives you the best possible visibility of everyone on downwind, either ahead or behind of where you are, on base and climbing out on the runway where possible. Peter, good airmanship would dictate the pilot behind would ensure he communicated well to the pilot in front, as he would not be able to see you. Yeah, Jordan's point exactly. Could have made maybe some more calls potentially to alert that pilot that he wasn't going to chew his tail feathers.
And that's really interesting hearing that, because a lot of the time we feel like we are communicating effectively. But obviously in that situation, the pilot in front needed more information from me. And that's sometimes where we get that mismatch of commercial pilots who operate in the commercial world and the RAOs pilots, or, you know, CASA, RPL, PPL holders that are just doing it for fun. So yeah, it's sometimes education for ourselves, but also education for the broader community to say, this is what we expect and this is why.
Yeah, and Neil speaks to using appropriate phraseology. Could we ask people not to use the expression departing for the training area for those people who are not familiar? I would suggest, and I used to ask my students to talk about departing for the northwest training area, which means that they know it's to the northwest of the airport. So it's not a bad thing to refer to the training area, but you have to give other pilots an idea of where that training area is. So northwest training area, as an example, would very quickly make people aware that northwest of the airport is where you're headed. Nicholas, quick one, no unnecessary chit chat on the radio in busy CTAFs. Totally. And again, if you want a war story, I was flying in a local area and I heard two pilots on the area frequency, which made me shudder, chatting about the fact that one of them was over the dam and the other one was not over the dam, and they were trying to work out where the other pilots were on area. That's not great. I'm sure the ATC, if they could hear them, were probably sitting there saying, for goodness sake, fellas, can you sort that out on a chat channel? Don't clog up airfield frequencies, CTAFs and area frequencies with unnecessary chatter. It is actually a breach of the regulation to have everyday conversations over the radio. And I don't think anyone's ever been prosecuted, but certainly there's been some good punch-ups in aero clubs potentially as a result. So yeah, that's a good one, Nicholas. Thank you. We'll give it a couple more seconds for more war stories to come out. There's been some really good examples. I think if we break down the key factor, regardless of the circumstances of there I was, there they were, here we are, etc., what we've got is the community of safety needing to interact with each other appropriately and give the other pilots or other operators in the airport, in the airspace, wherever it happens to be, the information that helps them understand their position. And one of the best things we can do, which is what we talked about from our currency presentation, was talking about armchair flying. So if you're about to do a nice big long flight from, you know, Bullamakanka to outer Bullamakanka and you're covering 3,000 nautical miles, fantastic. Fly it in your head or fly it watching Google Maps with satellite view to actually get an idea of the terrain you're going to be flying over, and if you're coming from a particular airport, how you're going to get yourself into that airport safely by using the correct circuit pattern from our current cap 166. Getting in from either a overhead midfield crosswind, coming in from the outside, joining on downwind, which speaks to Linda's point. Probably not ideal for a straight in from our perspective for a lot of reasons. Certainly one of the reasons why that pilot at Temora got caught was because it was a straight in approach and didn't spot the crosses until it was probably too late. So regardless of what position you believe is the appropriate one, plan so that you know where you're going and that you're on the correct side of the active or positioning yourself appropriately. Any last words of wisdom, Jordan?
Back to what you said, we're all in the community, we're all equally responsible for safety. Just remember, you know, we suggest make the requisite radio calls, but remember the only radio call that is actually required is when the pilot reasonably considers it reasonably necessary to broadcast to avoid the risk of collision with another aircraft. And we often get, you know, that's a BFR question, an instructor rating renewal question. So just remember that. And just remember it's alerted, see and avoid. Back to my point before, make sure you look out the window. We're all in this together. We're all in this to make sure we get home at the end of the night and be safe. So just keep that in mind when you're out there flying. Perfect.
Yep. A little closing comment there from Lloyd. 2 aircraft at 90 knots and closing will occupy the same airspace in 20 seconds, 1 mile apart. It doesn't take long, and that could be the the moment, the 20 seconds you choose to look down at your iPad to reorientate yourself or confirm something, look up and you've got a screen full of aircraft. So certainly keeping the eyes out, active scanning, accurate scanning processes, using all the tools in the arsenal and not relying on any one thing, communicating clearly and accurately, and understanding procedures like I've got on the screen there will help us all a lot. So thanks everyone for your time. I'll call Cody back in. Thanks, Jordan, for your input. That was a really good presentation. Really appreciate all of the comments there from everyone. I knew as soon as I asked for war stories, we'd be absolutely inundated, which is great because we learn from those sorts of things.
Thanks, team. That's a fantastic discussion. I also chucked a poll up there, and 70% of people who responded to that said they'd encountered a near-miss event. So that actually ties in with our discussion earlier in relation to loss of control events, where 70% of people had also reported having encountered or nearly encountered a loss of control. So it is extremely common and something that we see a lot. A few key points I've taken away there. In terms of avoiding distraction and standard procedures at aerodromes and radio use. So many times where we hear of near-miss events is because somebody's done something non-standard at the local aerodrome. And whilst radios are a fantastic tool to assist with alerted see and avoid and be aware of other aircraft, they do also result in complacency where somebody becomes expectant that if I've not heard a radio call, it means there's no one else there. So it's key to understand that there's a range of reasons why you may not have heard a call. Someone might be on the wrong frequency, they might have had a radio failure, or they may not be equipped with a radio if they don't need to be. So making sure that the eyes are outside as well. And standard procedures like downwind at 1,000 feet is really important, and we often underestimate the importance of that. But for example, if you've got a high wing aircraft operating downwind at 950 feet, and you've got a low wing aircraft downwind at 1,050 feet, you're going to be in a position where the two aircraft can't actually visually see each other potentially. So flying accurately is also really important in terms of ensuring you've got the best opportunity.
Their altimeter is calibrated too, because otherwise we have even less proximity to play with. There was one more point I was going to make too that speaks to some of your takeaway events and messages, Cody, was use of IFR points versus VFR points can often be confusing. Obviously, the IFR pilots have procedures that they're trying to follow, but when they announce that they're RNAV for a particular runway relative to an airport, that doesn't help a visual flight rules pilot. And likewise, the flight rules pilot saying I'm over Fred's farm does not help the IFR pilot who doesn't know where Fred's farm is. So reference distance and bearing to an airport or a known location is the key for everybody, I think. Will also help with those sorts of collision events as well.
Absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you both for joining us this afternoon. That was a fantastic chat. Lots of comments coming through to thank you guys as well. So we really appreciate it and enjoy the rest of your afternoon. And I'm sorry for clogging up your day on a Saturday. Very rude.
That's okay. It was all good. We had fun. I've enjoyed it. And I hope people take some benefit from it.
Thanks, guys. Alrighty, so on that note, we will wrap things up there for this presentation, but we will be back very shortly where we have a discussion with Tim Howes and Dan Compton from Bushflyers Down Under in only 10 minutes. So jump over to that next stream if you want to be part of that conversation there as well. Just finally, I'd like to thank Garmin, who's a gold sponsor of National Safety Month and the sponsor for today's presentations. We really appreciate their support. And of course, all of our sponsors for National Safety Month. So jump over to that other stream if you want to join the next conversation, and we appreciate you tuning in this afternoon.